One of the first things we realize as we come to conferences like this is it is a fantastic time to be a developer.
I know, we're all kind of stuck in the weeds on how to really optimize our performance, but it's an amazing time for us right now.
It wasn't too long ago when we wanted to create a compelling UI, this is the stack we'd have to deal with, right? Or maybe on the other side, you'd use something like this, which is hard to say which is worse, frankly.
Yeah.
Or on the web, beautiful websites.
Beautiful.
Right?
Apple's known for beautiful. The web, beautiful web.
And then when you want to take that experience with you, you have compelling devices that you can do.
Mobile, it's in your hand.
It's amazing stuff. But really, we have come a long ways in a short amount of time with the devices that we all have, with the experiences that we can put in browsers.
Yeah, now think about all these 3D virtual reality things spinning around. It's amazing.
And the best news is they're all out of H-1B visas, right? So it's all us. It's all us in this room.
Leverage.
And it can go pretty high up, right? Like you can take this thing and really make a lot of money out of it. And even your friends, too, can make as much money as you did.
Go programmers. Go programmers.
So it is a great time to be a developer, but there's this one niggling challenge that I think all of us who are creating end-user experiences are facing. Do we do web or do we do app? And it's confusing because this is actually two distinct questions sort of rolled up into one, and sometimes you forget about this distinction, but do you use the web as a delivery platform, or do you use it as a technology platform, or do you do apps? And so we thought it'd be fun to explore this for a few minutes with y'all, especially sort of from a performance perspective.
So first of all, we want to get our biases out there because I think that's important when you kind of see people presenting from up here. So Steve kind of talked about where we've been before, and the key point here is that we have a very web-heavy bias in general.
And I think it's sort of hard when you compare it to other ecosystems to get excited about it because the web kind of feels like this, right? If you look at how we develop standards and how we get there, it's sort of a democracy, right? And these are real democracies at work, by the way. This is not, and it can get messy. And sometimes it's really tempting to look at other systems for creating technology standards and other technologies. And I mean, here you've got beautiful people who make all the decisions for you.
I'm from England. You just look up to the royals. And then we have the same thing on the technology side. We have our royals on the technology side, too.
And the fans, the adorers of the... And this system can be really attractive when you compare it to the democracy we just looked at. Until sometimes you realize...
Yeah, unfortunately, what's your dictator going to be like, Who's your king going to be? And then it can get even worse. Imagine you got a great king, but then his son comes along, right?
Sometimes.
You don't know what the son's going to be like. So even if you have this dictator that's given you this great world to build great experiences, who knows about the future?
So it makes you sort of look at democracy from a different perspective. Sometimes democracy can actually look really good when you realize the downsides of the alternatives. So we have a built-in bias towards the web, and we think that system works really well. But at the same time, we haven't lost sight of why we even develop software. How many people have even seen the bridge on the River Kauai? Anyone in the audience? Wow, this is perhaps an older crowd than we're used to.
Normally the kids I don't understand. Transformers!
But the key point of this movie is, the plot of this movie has to do with this group of British soldiers who are captured by the enemy during the war, during World War II, and they're made to build a bridge. And being British,
gonna do it right. What?
They really sort of get lost in the vision of creating this amazing high-quality bridge. And then when the Allies send in some forces to liberate them from the camp and blow up the British soldiers actually try and stop them, even though the bridge is serving the enemy. They sort of lost sight of the ends for the means. And so even though we have a preference for the web, if we need to use native technologies to realize the experiences that we want, we're going to do that because that's why we're creating software, not because we think the web is ultimately the end. The other bias we wanted to get out of the way has to do with mobile. So in this talk, we think that mobile is really the only thing that's worth focusing on, and we do this because we think that mobile is the future of computing. Because really, sometimes you look at mobile and you think it was all about replacing crappy mobile devices with beautiful mobile devices, but there is another revolution sort of encoded in there that doesn't get as much play, and it's the world's first consumer-grade operating system, iOS. It's just sort of amazing when you look at how kids are able to use this operating system. And this is really the revolution that excites us the most. And it's really clear that this is coming back over to and converging with what we used to call the desktop. And the desktop operating systems of today are becoming sort of the workstation, professional-grade operating systems of tomorrow. And it'll all just fold in together. And so we think just focusing on the mobile context makes sense because that's the world of the future and the world that we're all in now. So having gotten those out of the way, web versus apps.
So one of our former bosses, this was back at Palm, we're going like, hey, it's inevitable. The future's clearly going to be web-based. There are these massive advantages to go in with the web. And so Ruby would just kind of talk about, you know, the people that are into this native thing, that's old thinking. It's inevitable that the web is going to win.
You got other people who say that, you know, native apps must die for one reason or another. This guy's argument is that, you know, there's too many icons. It's too much pain to organize these, so the web should win because it's simple and clean. You don't have the icons, unless you look at Dion's bookmark folder, in which case it's pretty bad.
And then you got the business guys. You got the VCs out there. Isn't it fun when the business guys talk about HTML5? They're out there blogging about how this is going to be the next big thing for content. Did you understand that?
I was going to say, I don't actually know what Roger's saying in this post, but it's, yeah, I don't really know actually. But so there's this inevitable sense that the web's going to win. And the funny thing about inevitability is that they don't always come to pass. But it's easy to see why people think the web is going to win on mobile. Because if you go back and you look at the last computer revolution, the microcomputer revolution, it was interesting to see the role that the web played here. So microcomputers, initially there's a lot of different platforms, a lot of different operating system choices, and these consolidated down to a winner based on an app advantage that they had accrued. And then based on this advantage, once other players tried to come into the market with other innovations, they were shut out. There was just no path to market because of that advantage. And what we learned from this story is that when one of the players gets this monopolistic great advantage and wins in the marketplace, they really want to...
They want to give back to you,
They want to reward the consumers.
They want to reward you.
They got them there.
Give you
with
the
quality product. They really go out of their way to produce some quality product.
So what broke us away from... What broke us away from the world of ME and the Windows dominance? We think that largely it was the web. The web came along and gave us this virtual machine into a whole new world. Instead of thinking about productivity and needing to use Office and the like, now we suddenly want to go to these amazing experiences and get access to all of this information that's out there on the web. That was the thing that actually broke the dominance.
And so this is why people think the web is going to inevitably play the role in mobile, I think. And it explains why a couple of years ago when Microsoft announced IE9, the pivot was so sudden you could actually hear it. Did you remember? Like they came out here and said the web is the future. Silverlight, that was last year's play. And the Silverlight team was literally like, what, hello? What? We're still here! You know, no one told us. And then when Windows 8 came out, they went even further and said, you know, HTML is actually the preferred developer platform, not some proprietary Microsoft thing. And it was easy for them to do this because this was actually the same strategy that Apple had used. If you remember when Steve Jobs came back, the I in front of the iDevices meant the internet explicitly. And the marketing strategy wasn't, hey, you know, buy a Mac because our apps are better or our operating system is better. It was buy a Mac because this is the fastest way to get into the internet, and the internet is all that matters. And so there's the sense that the internet's going to play this role, and so everyone's going to do web apps eventually, we should just do it now. But when you dig into this, it's not really clear to us that the same factors that led to the web playing that role are going to repeat themselves.
Yeah, we've got to look back and see what the web actually was beating right then. Think about how you actually got software back in the day. You'd have to hang out with this guy, right? Your mom would have to go down to Egghead Software, chat to this guy, can I have the box over there, and like do something that she naturally wouldn't really want to do, but finally she gets the software, and then what's next?
You come home and you have this amazing installation experience. The floppies in and out.
Please put in disk 3.
But once you go through all that pain.
Yeah, the reward at the end of amazing experiences, you're there, you're home.
So when you look at this, it's actually not really clear that the same factors that led to the web exist today. In fact, if you look at them, it's not really clear who's even winning in this area. And then when you go to the quality of experience, you have a really big, clear winner. And then there's this factor. The fact that Apple is openly saying that, you know what, we don't want any platform other than our native platform to be the intermediary between us and our users, and we will actively stop that from happening, which makes you wonder if the web starts to gain momentum over apps on that platform, what they might do since they control the only web rendering engine on that platform. So there's that series of arguments. But then people will come out and say, well, the web's going to win because of the reach. The web's everywhere, so clearly it's going to win. When you break that down, you start to realize that apps aren't really doing that bad on the reach front. If you look at this chart, the blue line represents television, and the red line represents the app ecosystem. And you realize that the audiences that apps are reaching are already bigger by some measurements than all internet audiences combined. And it's pretty massive, the audiences that you get. The same survey pointed out that basically like Monday Night Football was actually trumped by app audiences. And then if you flip it over and you look at the trends that we're seeing, the trends are actually quite clear. And if you quibble with the data points, that's fine, but the trends are undisputable. App audiences are getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time and becoming rapidly the largest addressable audience. And then you look at individual app data points.
So Angry Birds came along. It didn't come across to the web first. They snuck it into the Chrome Web Store at some point. But you look at the massive scale. Like, they've sold more Angry Birds titles than Super Mario titles over its entire history. And you just start to see the kind of acceleration go on through these different apps.
And then you realize that a bunch of apps really have no problems at all attracting massive audiences even faster. So clearly, it's not that you need the web to get the reach you once did, which explains why increasingly we're seeing startups just bypass the web, just decide, you know what, we don't even need a web experience. We can just get the audience that we need by targeting apps directly.
What was that?
I don't know. And some people make the argument that, well, this was about technology. There's no way you could do something like Flipboard on the web. It's just
it's impossible. There's no way you can do a Flipboard experience on the web. Oh, this guy just did it in a couple of hours. But really, there's no way that you could do it.
But if Windows Phone or BlackBerry ever catch on, you're ready,
You're ready. Pole position.
You can get your web assets to those platforms. You're set. You're good to go. But then if you pursue this argument a little bit further, you start to realize, wait a minute. If you don't do the web, and you do native, then surely, I mean, this is a nightmare, right? You've got to do a web experience because you can't ignore that audience. You've got to do iOS, you've got to do Android. And as we look at this, we worry about it from the Walmart perspective because eventually what happens if we do add Windows Phone? What happens if Android tablets catch on? I mean, today it's like free tablet getting handed out to a bunch of Google I/O attendees. I don't know, it's pretty scary from a fragmentation perspective. And then if you add in the other markets, oh my gosh, maintaining all these code bases starts to feel like solving a Rubik's Cube, except it starts to feel like sort of a jumbo-sized Rubik's Cube. It starts to feel like a really big headache. And then there's sort of the fact that it doesn't feel right at all. For example, let's say you've got really successful content that you've produced that you're distributing through one channel, and you decide you want to get that to another channel, to DVD. Does it make any sense that when you want to shift channels, you've got to like recast the whole show and create the content all over again? I mean, that's a pain in the butt. And then you can't afford for this distribution channel to pay them $1 million per episode. So you got the B cast. In this case, they're not even looking at each other. It's quite clearly airbrushed in there. And then when you get to the smaller markets,
yeah, feel bad for the guys that are on the niche markets, right? Like, what's the experience that they're going to get?
This just doesn't feel like, how could this possibly be the right solution? So, the whole web versus apps argument is a really complicated debate. We've sort of gone through some of the macro issues. In a different talk, we'd love to go through some of the micro-technology issues with you. But from a performance perspective, we think there's some interesting things to consider. And so let's dive into that right now. Because I think if your goal is to create the most performant UI you can in terms of pushing graphics, pushing pixels around, clearly there's nothing that's rivaling native platforms right now, right?
Yeah, we're just seeing amazing things happen on these platforms. And iOS did a great job kind of making the default nice and putting your view layers directly against the GPU and all of that stuff. And we're just seeing continued evolution on just making these richer and richer, beautiful transitions. The FIPS is just, just kind of pedal to the metal all the time.
So if this is what performance in user experiences is all about, then clearly we can just declare apps the winner. But it turns out graphical performance really isn't the #1 ingredient to creating compelling experiences. It turns out responsiveness is really what creates the emotional bond that users have with the application. And that's really what the focus ought to be on. And the great news for us is that the web really doesn't prevent us from creating really responsive applications. The web has no disadvantage at all in this space. But actually, you can actually create responsive enough applications with the web, but then you have this other issue where you actually have to get the data to your user in order to respond to their input in a fast way and display something to them. And so the web may have a disadvantage here, but actually you can use something like PhoneGap and load all that stuff up front on the device and use the web as a technology platform and not necessarily as a delivery platform. And so when you start to look at this, it's not clear that the web has any big disadvantage or advantage here. But then you have this factor. When you open up a native app, you want it to be a native app, right? When you go to a De Niro movie, you want to see De Niro. You don't want to see this other guy pretending to be De Niro. You want to see De Niro. But then when you flip it on the other side, there's the fact that maybe users don't actually care, right?
Yeah, and we get this debated a lot with our UX teams on what's important and what's not important, and kind of you can go to different extremes. You see people A/B testing away the flashiness and focusing on the responsiveness. But I think it's still a little bit of a debate in there.
Yeah, it's hard to argue that your users really care whether or not the precise buttons are exactly the right shape for native, and if all the effects are exactly the right native effects. And so you see a lot of people, when they want to approach web or other immersive technologies, just sort of create a UI style that doesn't particularly look native, but does represent the quality interface that you want to deliver to users. And so this debate about whether or not you can get the web to look native doesn't actually appear to be the biggest piece either. You can actually use the web to create great experiences and sidestep the native debate. And the great thing about the web is it gives you that cross-platform piece that lets you sort of leverage iOS and Android together, and so you can develop the experience once. But there can be some occasional challenges.
Yeah, and this is actually one of our biggest pain points. We do some native and web hybrid solutions, and the Android problem is a real problem for us. We run into issues all the time, large scale, where we have some HTC device on some version of Android. If it dynamically loads some JavaScript, it just crashes the web view entirely. And it's just constant pain getting it to work across all of these different systems.
So here's a little murky. But there is an area that we think the web presents a really compelling advantage, and that's sort of this culture of velocity, this culture of performance optimization that's embodied by the conference we have here. Because as you look at apps, how many people's significant others' spouse's phone looks like this, right? Like I pick up my wife's iPhone, it literally looks like this, right? So if you use the app distribution channel, the tragedy is that this culture of performance is a culture around measuring and optimizing and delivering the new experience. That's what we're all about in this room. And how can you participate in that culture if you can't actually deliver the new experience that you've optimized, if you have to wait for these monthly or bi-monthly release vehicles that may not actually be taken by the user? And so this is where we think the web really shines in the web versus apps debate that we're all having. And there are a couple of interesting use cases along these lines. One is Voodoo. This is the video on demand company that we bought over at Walmart. And they are on a bunch of different devices. And for them, they wanted to update the experience as often as they could imagine. And to get on really constrained devices, they actually created their own rendering engine based on Lua. And so from scratch, they wrote their own GUI toolkit, their own environment, everything based on Lua script, so that they can just send the entire experience with script over the wire and re-render that. Is that the right approach for us?
Right. These days, you can just use the web. The web is fantastic at accomplishing different device sizes and the like. It's a great rendering platform. So why don't we just use that to be able to get us to these different systems?
Netflix is another interesting example because that's what they did. They created a WebKit team that creates a WebKit for all of their OEM partners. And so their policy is, listen, if you want to be a tier 1 partner with us, you've got to put this WebKit on your device so that we can send the experiences we want to down. And Netflix is an example of a company that's constantly measuring and optimizing for this. And so as we look at this strategy, this is where Node comes into the picture and really excites us, because Node enables something really exciting in this notion of serving these dynamic experiences that change. And it has to do with the technology that we call conditional tier rendering that has us just really intrigued. And to explain it, you sort of envision your experience with like your server and your client. And it turns out that, especially in mobile, some devices are really powerful, and you want to serve, your JavaScript to that device, and the device will execute the script and render the experience on the client, and get just the data from the cloud. And that way, what you transfer over these really small mobile pipes with high latency is just the data that you need. But then other clients that come into that experience really don't want to render the JavaScript, and you certainly don't want them rendering the JavaScript. So you want the capability to render that on the server. And what's magical about Node is it enables you to render the script in both tiers, which is really exciting. And then when you have other low-powered devices that come across, like a BlackBerry, like a legacy BlackBerry device, you can still render it on the server. And it's a policy decision, not a technology decision, because in the old days, you'd have Java or PHP or Ruby on the server, and you'd have a technical decision where that logic would be executed.
And so we actually tried this out. We built Function Source, this little blog site, on top of this technology to kind of give it a whirl. And so we build these rich MVC client-side views in JavaScript, and then we have a system that allows you to just render that on the server. So if you're coming through Google, you see JavaScript rich application coming down. But if the Google bot or something that's a weaker device, it just sees serialized HTML come across the wire. And we're seeing a lot of people kind of push this and go in different directions with this general approach.
So going back to our explanation here, let's go back and look at this rich client for a second. The other problem you have with this technique is when you initially go to the experience, we're going to pick on Twitter for a second, not in a terribly bad way, but the problem is you serve down the JavaScript, and then the JavaScript, once it's loaded, then goes back to the server to get the data, and then displays the experience, and so you get this waiting indicator. And what's exciting is what happens when you put it in both tiers. When you put it in both tiers, then it's, again, just a policy decision. The first time the user comes in, you decide to just send down the HTML and render the HTML experience, and then as you click around in that experience some more, you just send down the data because the script is in both tiers, and you can make the decision now that you have all of it to execute it on the client for minimum latency. And so we think this is an area where the web really shines in this web versus app debate. But to wrap up, it's a really complicated debate right now in the industry, web versus apps. And we think that when you look at the performance culture and how you can use performance optimization to continually improve, the web presents a really unique and exciting advantage, especially as we look at technologies like Node that enable conditional tier rendering. Thank you.